Hey guys! Tonight we time travel to a place where sleep comes in short bursts and silence is sacred deep within the damp, echoing walls of a medieval monastery. You're not wearing pajamas here. No, tonight you're wrapped in a heavy woolen robe that itches slightly at the neck. Outside, it's pitch black. No moon, no torches. Just the faint drip of rain off a stone ledge and the whisper of sandals brushing against ancient floors. You walk barefoot across freezing flagstones, your breath blooming like ghost puffs in the cold air. Your steps echo, even though you try not to make a sound. Somewhere ahead, a soft bell tolls one clear note in the dark. Not a grand cathedral chime, just a gentle tap that says, "Wake up. It's time to pray." You don't have a watch. No sundial could survive this gloom. And yet, you are somehow exactly on time. Welcome to the Midnight Office, Matins. This isn't just a one-off. You'll rise again before dawn. Then again, then again. 7 or 8 times a day, every day, until you forget what uninterrupted sleep ever felt like. And here's the kicker: if you're late even once, your dinner gets halved and you have to recite all 150 psalms aloud in Latin. Yeah, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it there? I'll be reading them while pretending to be productive. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're trailing behind the other monks now. Their robes shuffle ahead like ghosts in a line, each holding a tiny flickering taper that barely illuminates more than a few feet ahead. The bell's still ringing one note every few seconds, pace slow enough to stop your heart from racing, but steady enough to draw you forward. The chapel doors creak open with a sound like an old boat straining against a dock. Inside, the air is colder, somehow holy, but also humid. This is the midnight office, one of the hardest hours in a monk's day, or rather night. It's called Matins, and it's the longest and most sacred of the 8 canonical hours. Here, prayer becomes a sort of sleepwalking discipline. You don't question why you're awake. You just are. Some monks fall asleep standing up. Others hum half the psalms out of habit, their minds drifting somewhere between dream and devotion. What's odd is how everyone knows when to arrive. There's no one shouting, "Hey, it's matins o'clock." No alarms, no timepieces. Just an internal rhythm drilled in by habit, sleep deprivation, and something else. A kind of early system. You're starting to suspect the bell wasn't rung by divine inspiration, but by a human hand. A very sleepy, probably grumpy hand. And you'd be right. Back then, telling time wasn't about numbers. It was about light and shadow, about gut feelings and candle lengths, and about someone, usually a low-ranking brother, sitting up in the dark, trying to figure out whether it felt like 2 a.m. yet. Imagine your worst guesswork morning multiplied by the anxiety of possibly waking the entire monastery too early. Worse, too late. There were no second chances, no backup systems. The bell either rang on time or chaos broke loose in the most passive-aggressive, monastic way possible. One key fact that's both charming and brutal. Monasteries operated like little time bubbles. Inside, everything ran according to a sacred rhythm laid down by Saint Benedict back in the 6th century. According to his rule, monks were to wake, pray, eat, work, pray again, and repeat in a rigid, divine structure. Why? Because God doesn't sleep, and therefore, neither should his most devoted servants for long, anyway. Now, the fringe bit. Some monasteries actually assigned different brothers to watch the stars or moon phases so they could better guess what time it was. Others used candles marked with lines to indicate hours burned to the third notch and it's time to ring the bell, of course, if someone sneezed near the candle and it went out. Oops, guess everyone's sleeping in today, or worse, waking up at 10 p.m. thinking it's dawn. Some monks even swore the Holy Spirit would nudge them awake at the right time. Historians still argue whether that nudge was divine, or just a side effect of eating too much barley bread. You can almost imagine the scene now. A small, shivering figure in a corner cell, watching wax melt, eyes fluttering between doze and duty. One drop of wax hits the wood and he jolts awake. He lights a taper, stumbles to the belfry, and pulls the rope. The first chime rings out into the night, bouncing off cold stone, slipping under doors, curling into ears that have never known. A full REM cycle that sound one bell, then two becomes the medieval version of an alarm clock. Only it's analog, human-powered, and fueled by equal parts fear, faith, and fermented porridge. And here's where your curiosity really kicks in. Because this weird midnight ritual, it slowly plants the seeds for something much bigger. This ancient need to wake up at the right time, not just for you, but for a whole community that's the beginning of mechanical timekeeping. And believe it or not, monks were the ones who, quite by accident, set that clock ticking. But for now, you just slip into the chapel with the others, chanting softly, blinking against the candlelight, and wondering, how in the world did they always know? You're seated now, cross-legged on a cold wooden bench in the dim chapel. The air smells faintly of beeswax, wet stone, and the pages of very old books. The only light comes from high, narrow windows, letting in moonlight that barely touches the floor. One monk nods forward slightly, catching himself before face-planting into his psalter. It's matins. Yes, but it's also prime time for sneaky naps, and yet no one misses it. Night after night, they show up right on cue. Why? Because the structure of the day here isn't random, it's a holy routine carved into the monastic lifestyle like grooves in an old walking stick. You're living under the rule of Saint Benedict, and it's as strict as it is sleep-deprived back in the 6th century. Benedict wrote what would become the gold standard of monastic discipline, a detailed blueprint for when to pray, when to work, and yes, when to wake. Everything from the number of psalms to chant to how to fold your hands during prayer was covered, and central to it all, time. Time wasn't just a helpful concept, it was sacred. Prayers had to be offered at specific hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Miss one and you weren't just latu were out of sync with heaven. Now, here's the kicker. Benedict never handed anyone a sundial. He didn't say, pray at 2:47 a.m. sharp. No, he assumed. His monks would just know, which worked fine in sunny Italy, where you could gauge time by the light. But fast forward a few centuries, and your monastery is tucked in the foggy hills of northern France, where winter days are about 3 hours long and stars are obscured by near-permanent drizzle. That's where the problems begin. Monks still had to pray at all those hours, but suddenly, the sun wasn't enough. So they adapted. And this is where their obsession with accuracy and their creative streaks start to shine. First, they tried body clocks. You might chuckle, but monks were trained like human metronomes. Do the same thing at the same time every day, and eventually, your body starts preempting the bell. That worked for a few monks until Brother Elfric got the flu and slept through 3 prayer sessions. Oops. Next came observation monks. 1 or 2 brothers were assigned to sit up and guess when it was time to wake everyone else. These guys had the worst job in the abbey: cold, boring, and full of guesswork. One too many false alarms, and you'd find your porridge replaced with stale barley and the abbot staring at you like you'd just knocked over a relic. Then came the stand-in. Timekeepers, candles. These weren't ordinary birthday candles. They were tall, beeswax monsters that burned slowly and evenly. Monks carved notches into them. Each notch represented roughly an hour. Light the candle at bedtime, and when it burns down to the third notch, boom. Time to ring the bell. Simple, right? Until it wasn't, because candles are temperamental. They burn faster in drafts. They melt oddly when the wick leans. And then there's Brother Ambrose, who accidentally used tallow instead of beeswax and woke everyone up 2 hours early. Some say it took a full week before the abbot spoke to him again. Historians still argue whether this candle method was reliable or just a clever illusion of control one step above praying for divine nudges. But clever, absolutely. And it didn't stop there. You discover something particularly strange. Monks in certain abbeys even used measured oil lamps. They'd let a specific amount of oil drip into a bowl, watching it slowly rise to a set point. It's fussy, smoky, and requires more patience than a medieval scribe with carpal tunnel. But it's a clear sign. Monks weren't just enduring their routines, they were engineering them now. Picture this. A sleepy brother sitting on a wooden stool, eyes glazed, watching a candle inch closer to the notch. Outside, snow falls in thick, silent clumps. The wind howls like an organist in distress. And this poor monk. He's gripping a stick with a tiny bell on the end, ready to ring it the moment the wax hits that sacred line. And guess what? It worked. Not perfectly, not always, but enough to keep the rhythm going. And in doing so, these monks were beginning to think like engineers. Not intentionally, they weren't trying to change the world, but their obsession with prayer schedules slowly laid the groundwork for accurate, repeatable timekeeping. Here's your quirky tidbit of the evening. In some monasteries, the candle method became so central that monks started competing to invent more elaborate time-burning systems. One particularly ambitious brother tried embedding small weights in a candle that would drop and hit a bell. Did it work? Not really. Did it wake the cat? Every single time. Even so, those little oops moments carried meaning. They showed that the monks weren't just spiritually disciplined, they were accidentally innovating. All of this effort candles, bells, drip bowls was born from one simple reality. No one wants to be the monk who oversleeps matins. That's how serious it was. In a world without clocks, the pressure to guess right became a constant low-level stressor. And slowly, that pressure sparked new ideas with dubs, ideas that would, 1 century later, evolve into something entirely new. But you're not there yet. You're still here in this hushed chapel, watching wax melt and wondering why your toes are completely numb. The bell has rung. The psalms have been chanted. The candles are extinguished one by one. You rise, walk quietly back to your cell, and lie down for another 2 hours of sleep before lauds. No alarms. Just the haunting echo of someone else's guesswork calling you back to prayer. You wake again, if you ever truly slept. Your eyes flutter open in the dark, and for a split second, you wonder where were when you are. Then you hear it. That single soft chime from somewhere above. The bell's back. And just like that, your body moves before your brain fully reboots. The candle's burned lower now, almost to the brass dish at its base. Your cell is dim, chilly, and smells like damp linen and old parchment as you stretch quietly. The monk in the next cell has already risen. His bare feet slap against the stone as he shuffles toward the chapel again, taper in hand, the flame dancing as if it, too, just woke up. You follow, yawning quietly, but this time your path diverts toward a low, arched doorway. It leads not to the chapel, but deeper into the monastery, into a cramped room tucked behind the scriptorium. Here, among dry inks and cracked writing desks, sits something unusual. a tall iron candlestick with a brass saucer. The candle is thick, etched with deep horizontal lines at regular intervals. It looks less like a light source and more like a ruler that smells like honey. This is no ordinary candle. This is a timekeeping device, perhaps the oldest kind still. Burning. Tonight, you're learning about the candle clocks, the clever workaround for a problem that literally kept monks up at night. You see, relying on body clocks and sleepy guesswork just wasn't cutting it, especially for abbeys in cold, dark climates where sunrise came late and prayer came earlier. So, Solomon historians still argue whether it was a monk from England, Ireland, or possibly Persia had the idea to mark candles into sections. Each line would represent a fixed amount of time, usually around an hour. As the wax melted down past each line, it provided a visual indicator of time passing. Simple, effective, and mildly poetic, if you think about it. Time, melting away one quiet inch at a time. But here's where it gets a bit quirky. Some candles didn't just have marks, they had tiny metal balls or pins inserted at each hour line. As the wax burned and the pin dropped, it'd hit a metal tray or tin below with a gentle clink. Instant automatic notification, the medieval equivalent of a snooze alarm with one setting. Now, imagine the scene. A monk, curled up in his robe, barely dozing. Then clink. The sound of brass on brass jolts him up. Not a fire bell, not a voice. Just the most elegant little ping. Like a fairy ringing a bicycle bell made of patience and fear. It wasn't perfect, of course. These candle clocks needed to burn in rooms without drafts, with consistent wax and wick thickness. One strong breeze or a malformed candle, and your alarm might arrive an hour earlier, not at all. Which brings us to the very medieval problem of blame. You see? When the candle alarm failed, the monk responsible had to own it. That meant confessions not just of sins, but of poor wax quality. Records show disputes over who carved the lines, who measured the wick, and who forgot to align the tray properly. The system wasn't foolproof, but it was one of the earliest steps toward externalizing time, making it visible, physical, and shared. Now here's your fringe tidbit. In some abbeys, monks created candles with color-coded wax layers, sort of rainbow timer. One monk described his as going from saffron to crimson to indigo by the 6th hour. Why? Possibly to signal different prayer periods or just because it looked nice. Historians still argue whether this was liturgical logic or a bored monk with access to too many dyes. You run your fingers along the grooves of the current candle, still warm, almost at the 3rd notch. Which means if the candle's on a stew, have about 20 minutes before the next bell rings. It's just enough time to observe something even stranger. Over in the corner of the room, tucked behind a shelf of ink pots and pressed herbs, sits a bowl. Above it, suspended by a tiny drip tube, is an oil clock, another experimental marvel. Here, the idea is similar. A slow, regulated drip of oil fills the bowl below. Once the oil reaches a certain point, marked by a tiny float or stick, the time has come. A whisper of liquid logic, as fragile as a sigh. And guess who monitored it? That's right. It's the most trusted sleep-deprived monk in the abbey. Usually a younger novice, too new to argue and too tired to lie. It was a job of patience, of sitting in the dark, watching oil fall drop by drop, trying not to think about anything except the next float line, or snacks. Definitely snacks. But here's what matters. These monks, whether fiddling with wax or oil, weren't just staying on schedule, they were starting to think in hours. Not in sunrises or gut feelings, actual measured increments. That mental shift from nature-based rhythm to mechanical awarenesses. What set the groundwork for modern clocks? Accidentally, quietly, by firelight. And there's something deeply soothing about that. In an age of buzzing phones and atomic clocks, they trusted wax and oil. They let nature guide them. They made fragile machines to measure their devotion. And even when those machines failed, they kept trying. Back in your cell now, you snuff out the candle. You lie on your cot, the scratchy wool blanket wrapped to your chin, the stone floor radiating its usual chill. Somewhere in the abbey, another monk is sitting in the candle room, watching that same wax pool toward the next notch. He's not thinking about time zones or deadlines or to-do lists. He's just waiting for a flicker. A tiny clink, a sacred interruption, and you fall asleep. Again, knowing someone else will wake you. You wake again, but this time, you're not pulled from sleep by a bell or a clink or the gentle nudge of your own guilt-ridden conscience. No, tonight you've been granted a rare treat, a personal tour through one of the monastery's most overlooked but brilliant contraptions, something that drips, ticks, and burbles through the hours with sleepy determination. You're led to a small, arched chamber near the herbarium. It smells of lavender and iron. There's a soft, persistent sound, plip, plip, plip. That rhythmic dripping is coming from a curious contraption squatting in the corner, an early water clock, known to the ancients as a clepsydra. Yes. Tonight, we dive into one of the monkhood's best-kept sleepy secrets: how flowing water became their next experiment in telling time. At first glance, this thing looks like a glorified soup pot with a hole in the bottom. But don't let the simplicity fool you. The monks who built it were working with logic, patience, and a fair amount of hope. The principle was simple: fill a container with water, poke a small hole in the bottom, and let the water drip slowly into a second container. When the second container fills to a marked point, time to ring the bell. Well, in theory, you crouch beside it now, watching as a bronze bowl slowly fills with chilly droplets. Each plop is a heartbeat, each ripple a reminder that somewhere a monk is tracking divine hours not by sunlight, but by gravity. Water clocks weren't a medieval invention, of course. The Greeks, Babylonians, and even ancient Egyptians dabbled in them. But what's fascinating is how monks rediscovered and reimagined these devices, usually without any direct texts from the ancient world. They weren't trying to be scientists. They just really hated oversleeping morning prayers. Here's your mainstream fact: several 9th–12th century monasteries across Europe recorded attempts at building and refining these devices. By the 12th century, larger abbeys like Cluny had installed more elaborate versions with bowls that emptied into weighted pulleys to ring bells, kind of like Rube Goldberg machines with a vow of silence. But like everything medieval, things rarely worked as planned. These clocks were sensitive, painfully so. The flow rate could change with air temperature. The water might freeze. The dripping might stop midnight because Brother Hugo accidentally washed his hands in the upper bowl, throwing the whole system off by 45 minutes. He insists he thought it was soup, and this brings us to your fringe tidbit. One French monastery attempted to flavor the water with saffron to make it more visible under candlelight. Did it help? Debatable. Did it stain the floor and the novice's robe? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether the real purpose of saffron water was illumination or if it just made the place smell expensive. Even when they didn't work perfectly, these water clocks were marvels of calm engineering. You sit there a while, hypnotized by the gentle rhythm. One drop at a time, they measured lives. The monks didn't need seconds or minutes. They needed rough cues, a nudge that said, time to pray again. And it wasn't just practical, it was meditative. Watching a clepsydra is like listening to the softest metronome. It matches the tempo of breath, of chanting, of the slow, repetitive cycle of the monastic day. Some devices even had float indicators little bits of carved wood or cork that rose with the water and pointed to hand-painted hour markers.
Oh, yeah.
Told some monks painted little suns, moons, or vines on the inside of the bowl to mark each period of prayer. Not just tools, but tiny works of devotion. Of course, every system had its loyal defenders and bitter rivals. One monk swore by candle. Clocks, calling water clocks drippy nonsense. Another refused candles, citing wax theft by certain greedy rodents. You can imagine the petty notes left on cell doors. Next time your drip clock floods my slippers, I'm telling the abbot. But slowly, patterns emerged. Trial, error, and soft obsession led monks to test everything from drip size to bowl material. They even noticed that clay bowls made gentler sounds, while metal bowls rang louder when drops hit tasteful for the hard of hearing or the cough sleep. You glance at the modern clock tower now and realize we owe all that tick-tock precision to these sleepy-eyed monks and their puddle experiments. By trying to please both God and their abbot, they paved the way for something bigger. And yet, none of it felt scientific at the time. It felt necessary. A practical solution to a spiritual problem. How do you wake up at 2:15 a.m. every single night without fail, when your only natural guide is the moon, and your candle just got eaten by the cat? You lean against the cold stone wall, listening to the plip, plip, plip of water falling. The monk beside you nods off. His head droops, but his fingers still trace the edge of the bowl. Even asleep, he's tuned to the rhythm of water and duty. Because, even in their dreams, monks are chasing time, and tonight, so are you. You're back in the chapel again. But this time, you linger near the bell tower, tilting your head upward, listening to the wind rattle the tiny leaded windows. The ropes hang like old vines, and the worn grooves in the stone floor tell you exactly where monks have stood, century after century, yanking those ropes with half-closed eyes and frozen fingers. Now, imagine being that monk. It's sometime around 3:47 in the morning, though no one's using numbers yet. You've been told by Brother August that when the second line of wax melts, you ring the bell. No sooner, no later. But that wax is burning faster tonight. Or maybe slower. Or maybe the wind from the hallway is playing tricks on it again. Either way, you're stuck in this moment, trying to guess time like it's a riddle designed to break your spirit. And here lies the real trouble. You are the bell ringer, the sacred timekeeper, the sleepy scapegoat. Tonight's tale centers around the most underappreciated job in medieval monastic life. The monk who had to manually ring the bell based on whatever half-reliable method was available. He was known as the night waker. And trust us, no one envied his job. Because here's the problem. If you rang it early, you risked disturbing everyone's rest hand. That included the abbot, who took his sleep and his schedule very seriously. Ring it late, and you'd disrupt the entire prayer cycle. There's even record of a monk being assigned stone cell penance for ringing the bell 15 minutes too late for lauds. Harsh, perhaps. But in this world, time wasn't money, it was salvation. You tiptoe up the bell tower steps. Now, they're uneven, chipped by centuries of silent foot traffic. At the top is a wooden beam, reinforced with iron hooks, where a thick rope disappears into shadow. The air smells of pigeon feathers and rusted bronze. This is where our reluctant timekeepers stood or sat, really huddled in cloaks, staring at their candles or water bowls, praying they hadn't miscounted the hours. And if you're wondering how these monks kept track when the candle line got blurry or the clepsydra froze over, well, sometimes they didn't. Some simply guessed. One brother confessed in a marginal note next to a psalm that he counted the number of times his nose itched, assuming it was a divine sign. Historians still argue whether this was sarcasm, stress-induced, logic, or just medieval allergies. Still, the job persisted. Night after night, through damp winters and howling winds, these monks sat alone, waiting for their moment. And they didn't just pull a rope once. Oh no, they had to ring in patterns. Some abbeys used 3 bells. Others had specific peals for different hours. Dong dash, pause dash dong for prime. Dong dash, pause dash dong dash per mats. It was like Morse code meets Gregorian chant. You peek into an old monk's notebook nearby. It contains diagrams, hand-sketched, shaky little maps of when to pull, how hard, and for how long. He's literally written, "Not so loud." Weak. You scared Brother William into dropping the communion plate, and that's the charm of it. The system was fragile, full of human error, sleepy missteps, and near-mystical rituals. But it worked most of the time, because these bell ringers weren't just hitting gongs, they were keeping the whole monastery on beat. Without them, everything unraveled. Let's toss in your quirky tidbit of the night in one Irish abbey. The night bell ringer reportedly trained a pet raven to caw loudly at the sight of the 3rd candle notch. It worked exactly once. Then the raven stole a biscuit and vanished. The monk never quite recovered his pride or his snack. But even with clever hacks and minor bird thefts, the system had its flaws. And that's when the desperation for precision began to turn into invention. Some monks started tinkering with levers, others tried weights. A few even consulted old Roman texts on hydraulics, though mostly to use as kindling, if we're being honest. Still, the idea had taken root. What if the bell could ring itself? And that, dear listener, is where the sleepy seeds of modern automation begin. Not in a lab, not in a palace, but in the freezing silence of a medieval bell tower, where one exhausted monk dreamed of a world where the bell would wake him instead. Of the other way around, you stare now at the massive bronze bell above your head. It's tarnished, streaked with old soot, but still regal, still holy. It's rung thousands of times, pulled by thousands of hands, one guessing, hoping, trusting, each one part of a long, blurry chain of sleepy innovation. You descend the tower slowly. Back in your cell, the sound of the last bell still hums in your bones. You close your eyes and imagine what it would feel like if that bell rang. On its own, you'll soon find out. You stir again, but something is different this time. There's a subtle clatter from the direction of the scriptorium. Not the usual bell or drip or candle clink. A soft, metallic tick. Then silence. Then another dot. You sit up, bleary but curious, and shuffle your way toward the sound. Tonight, you've been granted a peek behind the curtain of monastic ingenuity, into the moment monks stopped just watching time and started building machines to control it. Welcome to the monastery's best-kept secret, the early beginnings of the mechanical clock. Now, let's set the stage. We're in the 13th century, give or take a few groggy decades. You're standing beside a workbench covered in gears the size of saucers. Wooden shafts, bits of iron chain, and wax-smudged parchment sketches. There's a faint smell of oil and old onions. Someone's been snacking where they shouldn't, and here it is. A verge escapement. Doesn't look like much now, just a spindle with teeth and a clumsy-looking gear, but this awkward contraption will change everything. This is the mechanism that allows a gear to turn step by step instead of spinning freely. It's the key to regulated motion and, eventually, to self-operating clocks. It's unclear exactly who invented it. Historians still argue whether it originated in Islamic Spain, the abbeys of France, or some unknown tinkerer in England who probably just wanted a nap. But wherever it came from, monks were the first to see its potential. And oh, did they run with it. You crouch beside a wooden table where Brother Theobaldius, that's his real name, carefully fitting a gear onto an axle. His fingers are black with iron dust, and there's wax in his beard. You want to ask him what he's making, but he's humming softly to himself and counting to 10 in Latin between each tap of his hammer. He's building a weight-driven, clock-a-boxy contraption where heavy stones pull ropes, which turn gears, which eventually strike a bell. Automatically, you blink. Then blink again. Wait, did you say automatically? Yes, dear listener. 4. The first time in centuries, the monks are imagining a world where the bell rings itself. No more groggy guesswork. No more praying to the candle. No more training the raven. You peek at the prototype. It's crude, mostly wooden, with iron fasteners and a pendulum made of an old quill and lead beads. But it works, sort of. The weights descend slowly, the gears turn, and after a few seconds of thrilling, heart-pounding motion, the bell gives a modest tunk. Brother Theobald claps softly, looking as pleased as any man running on 3 hours of sleep and turnip. Stu can manage. This is where the medieval monks become accidental engineers. They weren't setting out to change timekeeping forever, they were just desperately tired and deeply motivated by ritual. When you have to wake up 8 times a day to pray, and your best tools are a candle and a pigeon, your brain starts getting creative. Here's your mainstream fact. By the late 13th century, mechanical clocks had started appearing in European monasteries, often built into towers, powered by weights and regulated by verge escapements. These weren't accurate by today's standards, but they were consistent. And in a world ruled by ritual, consistency was gold. The real magic? These clocks could ring bells on their own. The relief this brought was enormous. Imagine being Brother Reginald, the poor soul assigned night bell duty for 17 years, finally being told, "Go sleep." The clocks got it. Your quirky tidbit of the night. In one monastery, they decorated their clock with tiny, carved angels who rotated slowly every hour, holding up scrolls that read, "It is time." One monk reportedly bowed to them every time he passed. Historians still debate whether this was reverence or sarcasm. As these machines spread, some abbeys got fancy. They added dials, painted hour markers, even music boxes that played crude tunes during feast days. Bells weren't just for waking monks anymore. They became soundtracks of the sacred. The whole abbey would pause, mid-ho or mid-prayer, to listen to the chime that said, "This moment matters." You step away from the workbench, the image of those worry gears still echoing in your mind. You've seen the spark, now the moment. When sleepy necessity gave birth to mechanical marvel. This was no longer just about waking up. It was about mastering time itself. And yet, these early clocks were clunky, temperamental beasts. They needed constant winding, regular maintenance, and the occasional firm whack with a stick, which, let's be honest, applies to most things in the medieval period. Still, they worked. And they spread. Within a few decades, cathedrals in England, France and Italy began commissioning enormous tower clocks, some of which survive to this day. You can still hear the echo of those bells if you walk through certain squares at dusk. Their chimes are the distant grandchildren of the sleepy monk's candle. Still calling people to pause. Back in your cell now? You notice something strange. There's no candle tonight, no dripping bowl, no whispering novice, just silence. And then, precisely on cue, the distant clang of a bell ringing itself. A miracle. Maybe a machine. Definitely, you smile in the dark. Progress has arrived, and it ticks. The next morning, or what passes for morning in a world ruled by bells instead of sunshine, you rise before the call. Not because you're eager, but because your brain has started syncing with this strange, sacred rhythm. It's like the monastery has pulled you into its quiet choreography. Wake, walk, whisper, wait. Then ring. But today, instead of following the path to the chapel or the scriptorium, you're escorted down a steep, narrow stairwell. The stones are slick with age, and your candle flickers against walls covered in chalk sketches and cryptic notes. At the bottom is something that looks less like a monastery and more like a medieval time lab. This is the clock cellar. And you, dear traveler, are about to meet the next phase in sleepy innovation, the automated bell tower thundering monument. To monkish obsession. The room is thick with the scent of old grease, iron filings, and ink. Gears larger than wagon wheels lean against the wall. Chains dangle from the rafters like upside-down vines. Wooden cogs lie scattered in baskets like misshapen loaves of bread. You run your fingers over one. It's been carved by hand, each tooth-notched with monkish precision. You can almost hear Brother Theobald mumbling, too wide, too narrow, too splintery. As he fiddled with it for weeks, in the center of the room is a structure that looks like the skeleton of a giant chest. This is the clock mechanism, and it's more alive than you'd expect. Weights dangle from thick ropes, slowly descending with stately inevitability. Gears grind gently, tick-tocking their way toward the next bell strike. A massive horizontal drum rotates ever so slightly. On its side, pegs stick out at odd intervals. This is the genius part. As the drum turns, the pegs hit levers, and the levers trigger hammers, and the hammers strike the bell without human hands. You're looking at the earliest known programmed automation in Western Europe. Not just a timer, but a sequence. A machine with memory. A robot with rhythm. Here's your mainstream fact. By the mid-14th century, monasteries in Italy and England were installing these drum-based mechanical clocks. The most famous was in Salisbury Cathedral, installed around 1386. It had no face, just a striking mechanism and rang the hours using weighted gears and pegs. It ran for centuries, and the best part? Once it was wound, it kept ticking for days. You sit beside the mechanism now, watching the pegs roll past like sleepy little soldiers, each one destined to wake someone up, call them to prayer, or remind the cook it's time for porridge. It's hypnotic, calming, like a grandfather clock with holy orders. But of course, it wasn't all smooth ticking. The machine needed regular winding. That meant someone, usually an unlucky novice, had to climb into the tower every 12 to 18 hours to haul the weights back up. Not glamorous, not quiet, not optional. Your quirky tidbit of the night. One abbey tried using a goat-powered winch to rewind their clock. The goat reportedly refused to cooperate unless bribed with dried apples. Historians still argue whether this was innovation or a very medieval prank. And then came the tower dramas. You see, once these clocks went public mounted high on towers, audible for miles, they stopped being just monk business. Villagers began timing their lives to them. Bakers rose with the 5 a.m. bell. Farmers broke at noon. Lovers snuck out after curfew with one eye on the next toll, which meant when the clock was wrong, everyone knew. There are recorded complaints from townsfolk who insisted the monks had stolen 10 minutes of daylight by ringing the bell too early. Others claimed their bread burned because of a misfiring chime. One irate cheese merchant even left a wheel of spoiled goat cheese on the abbey doorstep in protest. No one ate it, not even the goat. Suddenly, monks who once tinkered in solitude were facing community feedback, and let's be honest, it wasn't 5-star reviews. This pressure led to even more innovation. They fine-tuned the pegs, adjusted the weights, greased the gears with a mix of tallow and lavender oil, smelled weird, worked great. Some even experimented with sundials as calibration tools, checking the shadow outside against the bell inside. A few abbeys got truly ambitious. They added astrolabes, tried syncing prayer hours with planetary motion, built elaborate models of the heavens that ticked alongside the bell drum. At this point, they weren't just monks. They were sleep-deprived astronomers with god complexes and You're still sitting in the clock cellar, wrapped in your wool cloak, watching the drum rotate. Slowly, precisely. Every tick feels earned. Every clink is a whispered promise that time's sacred time's still marching on. There's a peace in this place, not because it's quiet, but because everything here is measured, intentional, steady. The chaos of the world feels far away when the hours arrive exactly when they're supposed to. You close your eyes, let the rhythm carry you. Tick, tick, tick. And then, right on Kuklank's tower bell, strikes the next hour. No hands. No guesswork. Just centuries of sleepy brilliance, waking the world. You're not in the clock cellar anymore. Instead, you're somewhere a little brighter, higher up, with faint sunlight slipping through colored glass. The scent has changed: less grease and iron, more candle wax, parchment, and musty prayer. Books. You're in the scriptorium, the scribe's domain. And today's story isn't about gears or weight sits, about records, and how monks, those accidental horologists, started documenting every tick of their ticking creations. You pull up a wooden stool beside a writing desk. The desk slopes forward, worn smooth by elbows and years. Ink pots sit like little black moons beside bundles of goose feather quills. Above your head, someone has pinned a rough sketch of a bell tower with annotated gears. One note reads, "Try." Smaller gear teeth brother Hugo keeps tripping the lever. Tonight's chapter is about the written legacy of early timekeeping. The paper trail that shows how monks began to reflect, calculate, and even brag a little about their bells that rang themselves, because here's the quiet twist. Monks weren't just inventing these machines. They were also writing them into history literally. Marginalia in prayer books. Diagrams tucked inside herbal texts. Notes scribbled beside sermons. These time-taming contraptions slowly became part of their spiritual and intellectual landscape. Here's your mainstream fact. In the 14th century, monastic chronicles began including bell schedules as part of daily records. Some even logged mechanical adjustments, weather patterns that affected gear behavior, and when a particular monk forgot to wind the weights. These were more than notes, they were the blueprints of routine. One page you examine now lists the entire week's prayer bells, along with comments like, "Rain slowed the drum," and "Brother Ambrose forgot again." It's as much a timekeeping record as a passive-aggressive burn. Book. And then there are the drawings. You leaf through a thick manuscript with cracked leather binding. Inside, a detailed, if slightly wobbly, drawing of a mechanical clock tower. There's a bell at the top, 2 weights dangling down, and a spiral of pegs coiled like a snail shell along a turning drum. In the corner, a tiny monk waves his arms beneath a note that reads, "Beware the crank handle." You smile. It's oddly charming. The clock itself might be a masterpiece of pre-industrial engineering, but the monks never lost their sense of prime maze. My monks never lost their sense of humanity or humor. These were machines built in service of prayer, but also born from a lot of sleepy trial and error. Here's your quirky tidbit. One monk illustrated his clock's escapement mechanism in the margins of a recipe for leek soup, presumably because that's where he had spare parchment. Historians still argue whether this was practical cross-referencing or a sign that monks really couldn't stop thinking about time. Even over lunch, you reach the bottom of a scroll and find a debate scribbled in the same hand that wrote the Psalms. It asks, in Latin, is it holier to wake by instinct or by machine? A deep question. You picture 2 monks arguing softly in the hallway, one swearing by divine intuition, the other pointing smugly to his perfectly functioning gear train. Historians still argue whether the mechanical revolution in monasteries was driven more by faith, fatigue, or simply a monk's deep desire to never be late again. Maybe it was all 3. Over time, some monasteries began standardizing their timekeeping records. Certain bell sequences were copied and distributed. Other abbeys would write back with tweaks. We found better accuracy by lowering the weight by half a stone. Or move peg number 3, it scares the cat. It became an epistolary dialogue of innovation, all written in neat brown ink. Some of these manuscripts survive in archives to this day. Monuments to an age when the written word was both sacred and mechanical. And you realize the monks weren't just building clocks. They were building a culture of time. They were giving shape to hours, texture to silence, and order to the endless stretch of days. As you sit there, you try imagining life without this rhythm. Without bells, without structure, the days would blur, the prayers would scatter, the piece of predictability would unravel, which is maybe why these records feel so meticulous. They aren't just technical, they're emotional. A way for the monks to reassure themselves, we know what time it is. We know what comes next, and so do you. You stand now, stretching your arms as the scribes whisper around you, still hunched over their prayers and pegs. Outside the window, a soft wind rattles the tower's bell just slightly. It doesn't ring, but it's ready, waiting for its cue. One of the younger monks sneezes, accidentally smudging his ink. You glance at his page. He's drawn a tiny gear beside the word Amen. Seems about right. You shuffle down the stone corridor once more, only now you hear the bell before you see it dash ding ... pause ... pause ... not E side of Y last day. E. Rhythm now so embedded in your ears that your thoughts move with it. It's not just noise anymore. It's structure, comfort, even companionship. And tonight, you're about to discover just how far the bell's influence extended beyond the abbey walls. Because, guess what? These sleepy monks accidentally created something much bigger than themselves. Something that would ripple outward into medieval towns, reshape civic life, and eventually train every generation to come to fear one sound more than any other. The alarm clock? Let's rewind dash again. It starts with a town. Any medieval town will do. Picture cobbled streets, crooked buildings, moss growing on every surface, and market stalls where the cheese has been sitting in the sun just a little too long. Chickens run freely. Children yell things in Latin you definitely don't understand. Bakers slap dough at dawn. But what tells them it's dawn? Once upon a time, it was the rooster, or the sun, or a vague, shared understanding that when the dew dries, it's time to work. But once a bell tower was built, even a small one, suddenly, the whole town moved to monastic rhythm. Here's your mainstream fact. By the 14th century, many European towns had installed mechanical bells inspired by those first monastic designs. In Milan, Ghent, Norwich, and Lyon, civic leaders commissioned clockmakers, often monks themselves, to build public clocks that regulated daily life. Bells began marking not just prayers, but curfews, market hours, council meetings, and public punishments. Charming, right? You glance upward as you pass under a town gate. A narrow tower juts into the cloudy sky, and at its top, a bell, already turning slowly on its own. A gear system hums faintly inside the stone. A passing merchant glances up at the sound, then hurries on. He's late for something, and so it begins. Time moves from the private world of monks to the public life of townsfolk. Bells no longer just call the faithful, they call the farmers, the shoemakers, the gossiping neighbors. Everything becomes scheduled. Even naps. Your quirky tidbit of the night in one Bavarian village. A tailor sued the town council because the bell rang 15 minutes early for curfew, and he claimed it cut into his customer traffic. The council countered that he needed to trim both hems and expectations. This may be the oldest documented case of passive-aggressive local government, but here's the twist. As time became more rigidly marked, people's lives became more anxious. Monks once guessed with candles in clepsydras, but now townspeople watch the tower like it was judging them. Late to market. Everyone knows. Bells already rung. Missed curfew. Too bad, the gates closed. Locked out. Better find a kindly goat and snuggle up. Historians still argue whether this widespread bell culture made people more productive or simply more stressed. But one thing is clear. It changed behavior. Suddenly, tasks weren't done when needed. They were done. On the bell, work hours shortened. Breaks became fixed. And yes, punishments were timed too. In some towns, public floggings were scheduled to start at the 6th clang after noon. Hard to be fashionably late to that. You continue walking now, through the heart of a bustling town square. The bell overhead tolls a mellow 5 count. Stalls start packing up. A man yells, "Time's up." Not because he saw the sunset, but because the bell told him so. And then, you stumble across something stranger still. A small building with stained windows, partly buried into the side of the chapel. Inside, a school. And there, on the far wall, is a small gear clock. It doesn't chime loudly, just a faint click. But every student glances at it, waiting, dreading, yes. You found it. The earliest proto-alarm system used for daily lessons. Teachers borrowed the monks' bells and used them to regulate learning. Start of class, end of class. Time to recite Latin declensions. Time to go home and forget everything, and that teased the real beginning of the alarm clock's tyranny. No longer a gentle guide for prayer. Now a system of control. Discipline. Bells telling children when to learn and when to nap. Or more often, when not to nap. You sit down beside a crooked wooden desk. A child nearby dozes off, chin sliding slowly. Toward his inkpot, the teacher glares, but says nothing. He's waiting for the bell to dot, and you're struck by the irony. The monks invented these machines to free themselves to sleep a little longer, to pray more precisely, to stop worrying about the wax on a candle. But the ripple effect made bells into something else entirely, a ruler of all. Whether you were a cobbler, a scholar, a cook, or a child, your day now danced to a rhythm someone else set. Still, there's comfort in that rhythm. The same kind the monks felt, centuries earlier, huddled in their cloaks, listening for the bell. In the dark, and somewhere in the tower above you, the next chime waits, perfectly timed, perfectly inevitable. Ding, dot, dot, dot. You feel it before you hear it. Dong, dot, dot, dot. Another hour passes. Another moment marked. Another sleepy monk's invention, echoing forever. Now, with the town behind you and the echo of bells fading into soft evening hums, you find yourself climbing again a spiral staircase that grows narrower with every step. Your knees creak in protest. You're not even sure where you're going, but the air gets colder, and the stone beneath your feet begins to vibrate. There's a steady hum, not unlike a giant cat purring under the floorboards of time. At last, you emerge into the bell tower itself. The view takes your breath away partly from the altitude, partly from the thin wind whipping through the arched openings in the stone. Below, the town looks like a tabletop model. Tiny roofs, winding alleys, flecks of color that might be market tarps or laundry flapping in the breeze. Up here, everything is quiet. Until it is. Standing in front of you is the mechanical heart of the structure, a lattice of wooden frames, dangling iron weights, and spinning pinwheels connected to a set of gears the size of wagon wheels. At its core is the great hammer, poised beside the bell like a knight preparing to joust. This is the soul of the alarm clock, not a beeping rectangle on your nightstand, but a snarling, clanking, wheezing wonder of engineering, wrapped in rope, and sweat and faith. And guess what? You're going to help wind it. A wiry monk in a rust-colored robe hands you a crank. You begin turning. It's harder than it looks. Every rotation pulls a heavy weight, sometimes actual stones, up toward the tower ceiling. This weight, when released, will slowly descend, powering the whole contraption for hours or even days. Here's your mainstream fact. Medieval tower clocks were weight-driven machines, using descending masses to regulate movement. The higher and heavier the weight, the longer the clock could run without winding. Many required daily rewinding, but some advanced models could tick for nearly a week. You stop to catch your breath. The monk, smiling faintly, pulls a lever. Instantly, the mechanism begins to click-tick move. Gears rotate, the escapement rocks gently, and a peg nicks the cam. You hear it before you see it. Clang, the bell rings, and you feel it in your chest more than your ears. It's not just sound, it's presence. It's like being struck with awareness. You sit down on a worn bench against the wall, breath fogging in the cold air. Overhead, the bell settles back into stillness, but the tower doesn't feel silent. It hums, with anticipation, waiting for the next toll, the next command, the next pulse of time. And here's your quirky tidbit. One abbey in southern France tried tuning their bells to different musical pitches, creating a kind of accidental chime symphony. The townsfolk loved it. The neighboring abbey hated it. One anonymous monk scrawled in a letter, "It sounds like geese trapped in a forge." Still, the experiment caught on. Before long, bells were being cast to precise notes, some even engraved with their intended tone. And thus began the long road toward musical clock towers and carillons. Back in your bell tower, you peer at the ancient mechanism. There's no electricity, no buttons, just levers, pulleys, wood, and time itself. It's breathtakingly simple. And yet, it's everything, because this tower is the first true alarm clock. Not portable, not personal, not programmable, but predictable. And that made it powerful. Predictability meant control. Control meant peace of mind. Peace of mind in a monastery meant the divine could find you more easily. Historians still argue whether monks considered their clockwork devices sacred tools or merely helpful distractions. Some chroniclers saw them as extensions of prayer-mechanical ways to honor God with punctuality. Others worried that relying too much on machines dulled the spiritual instinct. But you, sitting here in the wind, with the gears whispering behind you and the sky darkening to indigo, you feel no conflict. Just gratitude. Someone's hauled stones, filed gears, scratched designs on parchment. Wound cranks, tested hammers. Burned fingers on hot waxall so a bell could ring when it should, without fail, and that, in turn, would let monks sleep better, pray better, eat better. It would let townsfolk trade fairly, children learn on schedule, bakers wake up before their dough fermented into something unholy. It would, eventually, become a wristwatch, but not yet. For now, the world still turns slowly, rhythmically. The hour chimes, the weights fall, and somewhere far below, a farmer rubs his eyes and begins to stir. Not because of the sun, it's because of you, or rather, the bell you just helped wind. Funny how one clang can hold so many centuries. By now, you've seen the gears, you've heard the clang. You've wound the weights and smudged your cloak with grease. But tonight's story isn't just about engineering marvels. It's about something sneakier. Because beneath all the prayer schedules and ringing bells, monks were also competing. That's right. You didn't think they'd resist a little friendly rivalry, did you? You descend from the tower, your boots clicking on the spiral stairs, and step into the abbey's quiet refectory. Long wooden tables, heavy jugs of ale, bread baskets so crusty they could double as shields. And at the far end, Brother Willibald, eyes gleaming behind his ink-stained spectacles. He's pointing proudly at a sketch. It's his new bell timing algorithm, he says, lowering his voice like it's a state secret. Supposedly, it cuts out 5 whole seconds between matins and lauds. You don't want to be rude, but who's counting? Turns out, everyone. Here's your mainstream fact. As mechanical clockmaking spread across monastic Europe, abbeys began subtly and not so subtly competing for precision. Records show letters exchanged between Benedictines and Cistercians, each describing new escapement mechanisms, gear improvements, or winding efficiencies. One manuscript from Cologne refers to another abbey's clock as impressively punctual for a southern device. Burn. You sip a ladle of weak ale, while Brother Willibald continues. He shows you a page comparing bell schedules from 3 different monasteries. See here, he whispers. We added a chime before prime. So technically, we ring more often than Canterbury. He beams, and now for your quirky tidbit. One particularly ambitious monk in Bavaria tempted to invent what might be the first snooze. Button a double-chiming bell that rang once, paused, then rang again 10 minutes later. His experiment was scrapped after the abbot declared it an indulgence of the flesh, although legend says he secretly loved it. Historians still argue whether this monkish timekeeping, one-upmanship, was about spiritual rigor or just tinkering pride. Maybe both. After all, monks were human. If they could claim their bells were more accurate, more timely, more musical, they could also imply their prayer lives were more devout. Soon, some abbeys weren't just making better bells, they were making fancier ones. Bronze casings, Latin inscriptions. One French monastery commissioned a bell so finely tuned it was named after the Virgin Mary, with the note it struck said to bring tears to angels and, allegedly, cats. This is how you end up with towers, not just full of ticking gears but full of reputation. You walk the cloisters now, feeling how the architecture frames time itself. Every column is a heartbeat, every shadow a moving sundial. A group of monks file past, each nodding politely. You hear them whispering behind you. Did you hear Durham added a quarter chime? Don't care. Ours plays a hymn on the hour. You chuckle. Medieval monk Twitter would have been exhausting. Still, this rivalry wasn't always petty. It pushed innovation. It made monks document their tweaks more carefully, share more openly. And when visiting dignitaries arrive, bishops, kings, maybe, even the occasional confused merchant, they'd be shown the bell tower first, not the chapel. You pass one monk polishing a gear like it's a relic. Another oils a pinion with lavender wax. The energy is focused, meditative, but you can sense the pride humming beneath the silence. Later, you're invited to a rare event, the Twilight Test Chime. It's a trial of a newly adjusted drum. The whole abbey gathers in the courtyard. You stand with the others, breath clouding in the cooling air, watching the top window of the tower. The gear clicks. The mechanism turns, and then clang. Pause, clang. 2 perfect strikes. Crisp, resonant. You swear even the sheep outside look. Impressed Brother Willibald turns to you, practically glowing. We're calling her Matilda, he says, named after my aunt. She used to shout exactly like that. You're not sure if he's joking. He probably is. Maybe, and as you make your way back inside, it dawns on you. This whole network of mechanical marvels didn't happen by accident. It happened because monks were secretly competing to make something better, more punctual, more beautiful, more waking, and you. You get to be here for it. Not to judge, not to win, just to witness. The strange, sleepy miracle of monastic progress, old one bell at a time. You're sitting in the warm flicker of lamplight now, tucked into a corner of the abbey library. The air smells of old leather, beeswax, and that particular musty comfort only ancient books can provide. The bells have fallen silent for a few hours. This, apparently, is one of the rare stretches of true stillness in a monk's day. Except, of course, it isn't entirely still. Not in your mind. Not when you're staring at a worn volume labeled Tractatus Horologicus. The Treatise of Timekeeping. Welcome to the philosophy of the medieval alarm clock. Because yes, monks built machines. Yes, they perfected the gears and filed the teeth and adjusted the pegs. But they also thought about what they were doing. They asked questions, not just how, but why. Why measure time? Why break the day into segments? Why structure life with metal instead of intuition? Tonight's chapter isn't about hammers or towers. It's about the meaning of bells. You crack open the treatise. The handwriting is tidy, a bit slanted, and absolutely confident. The author is unknown, though he refers to himself only as Brother Anselm, friend of the hours. Modest, yet poetic his premise. Time belongs to God, and man must learn to follow it, not with guesses, but with intention. The bell, he writes, is the mouth of time, which speaks the will of heaven in tones. Not bad for a guy who probably never left his abbey. Here's your mainstream fact. Many monastic orders during the High Middle Ages began formalizing rules of hours, sacred guidelines that assigned precise moments to each prayer, task, and ritual. The Benedictine rule was among the most influential, eventually adapted across Europe. The clock didn't replace God's rhythm, it interpreted it. And so, monks like Anselm began framing their mechanical inventions not as shortcuts, but as acts of devotion. To build a clock was to align oneself with divine order. To ring the bell precisely was to mirror celestial harmony. Still, even Anselm had doubts. On one page, he muses, what if, in following the bell, we forget to hear the silence? A beautiful line. You imagine him watching a candle burn low while the gears clicked nearby? Here's your quirky tidbit, a later commentator. Clearly less poetic, scrawled beneath it, than we are fools twice. Which, in monk terms, is probably the equivalent of a mic drop. Historians still argue whether this meditative reflection on time was truly widespread or the domain of a few philosophical outliers. Most monks, after all, were too busy hauling stones or copying Bibles to write treatises about time metaphysics. But the questions stuck. You shift in your wooden chair. It creaks. Outside, the moon peeks through the stained glass window. One of the smaller courtyard bells probably rung by a bleary novice chimes, the little hour of night. A soft, silvery note that fades almost before you register it. And you think this bell didn't just wake people up. It taught them how to live. It taught rhythm, patience, anticipation. It whispered, not now, but soon. No wonder it endured. As the candle beside you gutters, you trace the margins of Anselm's book. There are faint sketches, here gears, levers, something that looks suspiciously like a rooster wearing a mitre. Hard to say what that was about. You close the treatise gently, and then you imagine the broader picture. Across Europe, dozens, hundreds of monks just like Anselm are doing the same thing, writing, reflecting, questioning the nature of the very hours they live by. Some are scribes, some are tinkerers, some are just tired, but they all live under the same melody of structured time. Their clocks don't just chime, they shape. Their bells don't just signal, they sanctify. And you're starting to understand it. Not just the invention, but the intention. The quiet wisdom hidden in a schedule. The holiness of a plan. The strange beauty of living your life to the beat of something bigger than yourself. Somewhere in the tower above, a weight slowly descends. A peg inches closer to its lever. Soon the bell will ring again. Not to rush you, just to remind you, it's time. The wind has picked up outside, whistling faintly through the cloister arches. You wrap your cloak a little tighter and find yourself wandering toward a chamber most visitors never see, part archive, part workshop, part graveyard for clocks that ticked their last. This is where broken gears are brought to rest, and tonight it's where you'll uncover the surprisingly dramatic downfall of the monks' earliest alarm clocks. Because, with all good things, there came a time when time itself started slipping out of monastic hands. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. You step carefully between shelves, stacked with warped wooden wheels, bent bell hammers, snapped ropes, and mechanisms frozen in place like they were caught mid-yawn. Some are wrapped in linen, others are half disassembled. You spot one that looks like it was gnawed by a rat, or perhaps an overenthusiastic apprentice. With a chisel, it's a quiet graveyard, but not without ghosts. Here's your mainstream fact. By the late 15th century, secular clockmakers began rising to prominence, especially in cities like Nuremberg, Florence, and Prague. These artisans no longer monks refined the escapement mechanism, miniaturized gear systems, and began creating timepieces for private individuals rather than just institutions. The alarm clock, worn in the monastery, was about to become a product, and with that shift came some uncomfortable changes. You move toward a battered manuscript laid open on a table. Its ink is faded, but the message is clear. A monk's journal lamenting that the merchant clocks outshine ours, though they sing no praises. He's not angry, just a little heartbroken. His once humble abbey clock, built to guide prayers, now competes with shiny brass timepieces mounted in noblemen's halls. Some even chime with secular tunes, love songs, drinking chants, hunting horns. The sacred hour, replaced by a jingle. Your quirky tidbit for tonight. One wealthy German merchant commissioned a tabletop clock that, instead of a bell, released a mechanical bird that flapped its wings and squeaked. "Wake up, you sluggard." His wife reportedly threw it out the window before sunrise. Historians still argue whether monks viewed this transition as a loss of sacred control or a welcome spreading of their legacy. Some abbeys doubled down on tradition, maintaining ancient gear trains long past their prime. Others quietly hired city clockmakers to do repairs, their pride hidden beneath silence and incense. You step deeper into the archive, where a small display shows two side-by-side clocks, one made entirely of carved wood, with visible pegs and weights. The other, a polished brass marvel with an actual dial face, labeled hours, minutes, even phases of the moon. And for a moment, you feel the divide. One is faith-made gear. The other is ambition made visible. You sit on a low stool and imagine the tension. Monks who once ruled the rhythm of an entire town now find their bells outpaced by flashy public clocks in civic towers. Chimes meant to mark matins now echo alongside those that declare the opening of a wine shop. Change was inevitable. But it came with loss, not just of prestige, but of quiet. The more clocks there were, the more bells rang. Not just at dawn and dusk, but constantly market hours, work calls, warnings, even timed sermons. Cities became noisy with time. The spiritual hush that monks once curated slowly drowned in clangs. You lean against a stone pillar and picture one such monk, gray-bearded, robe patched, standing silently in his abbey courtyard as the town's new mechanical tower bell rings. It's louder, sharper, precise, and impersonal. Still, not all was lost. Some monks found new ways to innovate. Smaller personal alarm clocks emerged, many designed for wealthy travelers. A few monasteries even began producing these devices themselves, secretly competing with the city workshops they once considered vulgar. Progress, after all, tends to blur the lines. And so, in this half-forgotten room of broken parts and frayed ropes, you realize the truth. The monk's alarm clock didn't die, it evolved. It left the abbey walls, grew a dial, lost some faith, gained some flair, found its way onto our nightstands. You rise and run your fingers over a cracked wooden escapement wheel. Maybe it failed. Maybe it rang too early, or too late, or never at all, but it tried, and for one brief, sacred age, it told the time not for profit, not for progress, but for prayer. The bell above clangs softly again. You smile, still ticking. You leave the archive quietly, the wooden door sighing closed behind you. Outside, the night air is cool and thick with the scent of damp stone and rosemary from the herb garden. The abbey sleeps again, wrapped in its rhythm of bells and breath. But tonight, you're walking towards something different, something more modern, because now, it's time to follow the monk's invention as it escapes the abbey entirely, stepping into bedrooms, workshops, and eventually, the homes of the rising merchant class. Yes, your next stop. The invention of the personal alarm clock. You follow the cobbled path beyond the cloisters and toward a smaller side building formerly a guest house, now housing the abbey's experimental items. It's where the monks sent ideas that were a little too clever, a little too secular, or just ahead of their time. A flickering oil lamp lights your way. Inside, workbenches cluttered with springs, brass plates handing to schematics, and one very small object perched on a velvet cloth, a box, about the size of a bread loaf, smooth wooden sides, a tiny hinged lid. You lift it carefully and inside, a bell no bigger than a walnut, a gear, a dial, and a lever. This little creature is the ancestor of your bedside alarm clock. Here's your mainstream fact. By the early 15th century, craftsmen in German-speaking regions began developing portable, spring-driven timepieces, which eventually incorporated adjustable alarms. These were status symbols, luxuries, not necessities owned by the wealthy elite who needed to rise early for business, travel, or indulgently timed breakfast platters. But make no mistake, the monks paved the road here. Their bells taught. The world had to listen to time. You fiddle with the tiny clock's mechanism. It clicks softly. A tension spring hums beneath your fingertips. Set the lever, twist the key, wait, and ding. It's not loud, but it is enough. Quirky tidbit incoming. One of the earliest documented personal alarm clocks, built in the mid-1500s by a Nuremberg locksmith, was gifted to a noblewoman who insisted it be tuned to play a lullaby before waking her. Historians believe she was the first person in Europe to both snooze and vibe. Historians still argue whether these early alarm clocks spread organically or were deliberately marketed by craftspeople hoping to ride the wave of monastic timekeeping. Some believe noble patrons pushed the idea out of necessity. Others think it was sheer novelty because, let's be honest, telling your friends you owned a clock that could yell at you was probably great dinner conversation back in the abbey. Guest house. You notice a half-finished model sitting nearby. This one's covered in etching stars crescents, tiny saints ringing their own bells in miniature. Someone was having fun with it. That's the truth, isn't it? The bell began as sacred a bridge to God. Then it became communal, ringing for the town. And now it's personal, pocket-sized, private. It rings for you and you alone. The rhythm of time, once so public, now sneaks into individual lives. Schedules become internalized. Wake-up routines, productivity rituals, morning breath. You smile as you imagine the first person ever to slap an alarm bell with a pillow and groan, 5 more minutes. It all began here with monks too sleepy to trust their candle clocks. You walk back out into the moonlight, holding the little box in your hands. The abbey is quiet, but the world beyond its walls is getting louder. Busier, more time, dash-bound. And soon, the Industrial Revolution will arrive with its factory whistles, standardized time zones, synchronized train schedules, and yes, factory-produced alarm clocks by the millions. But even then, those mass-produced bells will still carry the DNA of the monks. They will still measure time in clicks and rings. They will still expect you to obey, and you'll still be making deals with your alarm clock in the morning, like, if I hit snooze twice. That still counts as discipline, right? Time, it seems, has always been a negotiation. You tuck the tiny wooden clock back into its velvet cradle and whisper your thanks. Not just to the object, but to the tired monk who built it, who tested the spring, who misjudged the chime and rewound it until it rang just right. His invention would one day shape every schedule. Every school bell, every shift change, every plain boarding group, every anxious glance at a wristwatch before a date. All from this quiet abbey. All from monks who, frankly, just didn't want to oversleep their prayers. You leave the archive quietly, the wooden door sighing closed behind you. Outside, the night air is cool and thick with the scent of damp stone and rosemary from the herb garden. The abbey sleeps again, wrapped in its rhythm of bells and breath. But tonight, you're walking toward something different, something more modern. Because now, it's time to follow the monk's invention as it escapes the abbey entirely, stepping into bedrooms, workshops, and eventually, the homes of the rising merchant class. Yes, your next stop. The invention of the personal alarm clock. You follow the cobbled path beyond the cloisters and toward a smaller side building, formerly a guest house, now housing the abbey's experimental items. It's where the monks sent ideas that were a little too clever, a little too secular, or just ahead of their time. A flickering oil lamp lights your way. Inside, workbenches cluttered with springs, brass plates handing schematics, and one very small object perched on a velvet cloth, a box, about the size of a bread loaf, smooth wooden sides, a tiny hinged lid. You lift it carefully on inside. A bell no bigger than a walnut, a gear, a dial, and a lever. This little creature is the ancestor of your bedside alarm clock. Here's your mainstream fact. By the early 15th century, craftsmen in German-speaking regions began developing portable, spring-driven timepieces, which eventually incorporated adjustable alarms. These were status symbols, luxuries, not necessities owned by the wealthy elite who needed to rise early for business, travel, or indulgently timed breakfast platters. But make no mistake, the monks paved the road here. Their bells taught the world how to listen to time. You fiddle with the tiny clock's mechanism. It clicks softly. A tension spring hums beneath your fingertips. Set the lever, twist the key, wait, and ding. It's not loud, but it is enough. Quirky tidbit incoming. One of the earliest documented personal alarm clocks, built in the mid-1500s by a Nuremberg locksmith, was gifted to a noblewoman who insisted it be tuned to play a lullaby before waking her. Historians believe she was the first person in Europe to both snooze and vibe. Historians still argue whether these early alarm clocks spread organically or were deliberately marketed by craftspeople hoping to ride the wave of monastic timekeeping. Some believe noble patrons pushed the idea out of necessity. Others think it was sheer novelty because, let's be honest, telling your friends you owned a clock that could yell at you was probably great dinner conversation back in the abbey. Guest house. You notice a half-finished model sitting nearby. This one's covered in etching stars crescents, tiny saints ringing their own bells in miniature. Someone was having fun with it. That's the truth, isn't it? The bell began as sacred, a bridge to God. Then it became communal, ringing for the town. And now, it's personal, pocket-sized, private. It rings for you and you alone. The rhythm of time, once so public, now sneaks into individual lives. Schedules become internalized. Wake-up routines, productivity rituals. Morning breath. You smile as you imagine the first person ever to slap an alarm bell with a pillow and groan. 5 more minutes. It all began here with monks too sleepy to trust their candle clocks. You walk back out into the moonlight, holding the little box in your hands. The abbey is quiet, but the world beyond its walls is getting louder. Busier, more time dash-bound. And soon, the Industrial Revolution will arrive with its factory whistles, standardized time zones, synchronized train schedules, and yes, factory-produced alarm clocks by the millions. But even then, those mass-produced bells will still carry the DNA of the monks. They will still measure time in clicks and rings. They will still expect you to obey, and you'll still be making deals with your alarm clock in the morning, like if I hit snooze twice. That still counts as discipline, right? Time, it seems, has always been a negotiation. You tuck the tiny wooden clock back into its velvet cradle and whisper your thanks. Not just to the object, but to the tired monk who built it, who tested the spring, who misjudged the chime and rewound it until it rang just right. His invention would one day shape every schedule, every school bell, every shift change, every plane boarding group, every anxious glance at a wristwatch before a date. All from this quiet abbey, all from monks who, frankly, just didn't want to oversleep their prayers. Let your breath soften now. The abbey fades into shadows. Now, the great bell rests, unmoving for a few more hours. The torches are out. Only candlelight flickers behind one upper window, where a sleepless scribe copies the hourglass on his desk. You stretch out on the wooden bench, arms behind your head, eyes drifting toward the star-scattered sky. No more ticking, no more footsteps. Just the gentle hush of night and the memory of gears long stopped. You don't need to remember every detail. The monks will remember for you. They always have. They'll wind the weight. They'll strike the chime. They'll keep the rhythm until morning comes. Let the quiet hold you. Let the story wrap around you like a worn woolen robe. You've walked cloisters, climbed towers, heard bells and ravens and prayers. And now, at the end, there's nothing more to do, just rest. Time will move on, but you're safe. Right here. Right now, so close your eyes, listen to the silence between each imagined tick, and drift into sleep, knowing that the world is still gently turning on gears oiled by faith, by curiosity, by the quiet genius of monks who didn't mean to change the world. They just didn't want to oversleep. Sweet dreams.